What's up, YouTube people? Shaggy the Rare. Live at the library. A little bit crowded today, but I don't think anyone's gonna mind too much. We spent about an hour reading some with Alexandre Dumas, The Three Musketeers, one of the most influential novelists of all time. Uh, Alexandre Dumas is a Leo, a black man who was contemporaries with Dickens. Oh my God, I just said Dixon. I don't know. He was contemporaries with Dickens. He was a black man. He was French. And the French all knew he was a black man. And still, these were by far some of the best sellers of the era. 1844. It's a huge, huge, noteworthy individual right here. And more people need to understand that even though these books are super duper long, they are by far uh, some of the most important things to you know, come out of that era in France because they were just such huge sellers. Kind of tells you how people were feeling at the time too. Looks back at a classical age in this one. Uh, they kind of felt like their high point was in the 1600s. So this kind of looks back at a time even before Dumas. But anyway, before we get started, shouts out to oh goodness, gee. All kinds of love to the r/alternate history of Discord. Uh, mad love going out to Octawave, to Rocket Brittany, um, all my Leos out there. Uh, Marie's probably tuning in on these as well. Shouts out Marie. Um, there's so many people. Continue needs to get some love. Go subscribe to Don't Watch Continue. He's gonna hit 1,000 here in a month or so. Y'all just wait. But anyway, man, they put a whole lot of fluff at the beginning of this. We're just gonna dive right into the story. The Three Gifts of Monsieur d'Artagnan the Elder. Meung, a pretty market town on the Loire, the birthplace of Jean de Meung, author of Romance of the Rose, was more or less used to disturbances of one sort or another because of the troublous times. But on the first Monday in April 1625, it appeared as though all the armed hosts of the Huguenots had descended on the place in order to make of it a second La Rochelle. Citizens seeing the women fleeing all over by the main street, and hear the abandoned children crying from the doorsteps hurriedly dotted their breastplates, and bolstering up their somewhat uncertain courage by seeking musket, axe, or pike, they sped toward the hostelry and the sign of Folly Miller. There they found a compact, ever-swelling group, all agog, milling about, full of curiosity and clamor. Panics were frequent in France at that period. Few days passed without some city or another recording an event of this sort in its archives. There were nobles fighting among themselves, the king making war on the cardinal, and Spain battling against the king. Besides these conflicts, concealed or public, secret or patient, other riots were occasioned by brigands and beggars, Huguenots, wolves, and knaves who attacked all comers. The citizenry always took up arms against brigands and wolves and knaves, and often against nobles and Huguenots, and sometimes against the king, but never against the cardinal or Spain. Accordingly, custom being what it was, on the first Monday in April 1625, the burghers of Ming, hearing the tumult and seeing neither the red and yellow standard of Spain nor the livery of the Cardinal du Rochelle, rushed toward the sign of the Folly Miller. One glance was enough to make clear everybody what was causing all this hullabaloo. The young man would let us sketch his portrait with one bold stroke of a pen. Imagine, then, a Don Quixote aged 18, a Don Quixote lacking breastplate, coat of mail, or thigh guards, a Don Quixote clad in wooden doublet, its blue, faded, and indefinable color, that combined a multitude of tints as dissimilar as the red of the deepest burgundy and the most celestial azure. His face was long, thin, and tanned, cheekbones high, a sign of astutness, and a jaw wide, the infallible mark of a Gascon, whether he wears a beret or no. As a matter of fact, the youth wore a beret, adorned with feathers of sorts. His glance was frank and intelligent, his nose hooked but finely chiseled, too tall for an adolescent, too short for an adult. He looked nothing so much as the farmer's son on a journey, were it not for the sword dangling from a belt of shagreen, which kept hitting against the calves of its owner when he walked, and against the bristling flank of his steed when he rode. Our youth boasted a steed so noteworthy that no man could fail to take note of it. A bare nag, it was 12 or 14 years old, with a yellow coat and hairless tail, but not without swellings on its leg. This nag walked with its head well below its knees. No martingale was unnecessary. Nevertheless, it managed to cover 8 leagues a day regularly. Unfortunately, the virtues of this horse were so well concealed under its weird coat and incongruous gait that at a period when everybody, connoisseur in horseflesh, apparently in Ming, it entered a quarter of an hour before the gate of Beardsey, created a sensation, and the discredit inspired by the beast naturally extended to its master. The fact proved all the more painful to young D'Artagnan to name the Don Quixote of this second Rocinante, because he was himself forced to acknowledge how ridiculous such a steed made him, excellent horseman though he was. Indeed, he had heaved a deep sigh as he accepted this gift from his father. He was aware, of course, that such a beast was worthy of at least 20 livres, but the words accompanying the gift were beyond all price. "My son," said the old Gascon gentleman in the pure green poix which Henry IV had never succeeded in shedding, "my son, this horse was born in your father's house some 13 years ago, and here it is remained ever since. This ought to make you love the beast. Never sell it. Let it die quietly, of an honorably old age. If you should go to the wars with it, then care for it as faithfully as you would care for an old servant. At court, should you ever have the honor to go there?" Monsieur d'Artagnan the elder continued, adding parenthetically that it was to be the honor in which his son's ancient nobility entitled him. "Be sure worthily to uphold the name of gentleman, which has been dutifully borne by your ancestors for more than 500 years. Do this for both your own sake and for the sake of your own people. I mean your friends or relatives. You know nothing from anyone save the cardinal and the king. Nowadays a gentleman makes his way by courage, do you understand? Courage alone. Whoever trembles but for a second has perhaps lost the bet which fortune held out to him in precisely that second. You are young. You ought to be brave for 2 reasons. First, because you are a Gascon, and second, because you are my son. Never avoid a quarrel. Seek out the hazards of high adventure. I thought you had to wield this sword. You have muscles of iron and a wrist of steel. Fight at every opportunity, the more blithely because duels are forbidden, and therefore it would be doubly brave of you to fight. After a pause, D'Artagnan's father went on. "I have nothing to give you, my son, except 15 crowns, my horse. and the advice you just heard. To these your mother will add a recipe for a certain balsam which she acquired from a gypsy woman. It possesses a miraculous virtue of curing all wounds which do not reach the heart. Take advantage of everything that comes your way. Live happily and long. Then, one more word, the old man added. I would wish to propose an example of you. Not mine, to be sure, for I have never appeared at court. Besides, I took part in religious war as a volunteer. No, I mean Monsieur de Terray. He was formerly my neighbor. As a child, he had the honor of being a playmate of our King Louis XIII, whom God preserve. Their games sometimes degenerated into battles in which the king did not always have the upper hand. His thumps and thwacks he received from Monsieur de Trevec inspired his Majesty with the esteem and friendship of his former playmate. Later Monsieur de Trevec fought amongst others on his journey to Paris 5 times from the death of the king to the majority of the young king 7 times, excluding all the wars and seasons he has been through from that date until now. I do not know how many times, possibly 100. Despite all of these edicts, ordinances, his musketeers, in other words, the leader of the Legion of Caesars, highly esteemed by his Majesty and dreaded by the Cardinal, who is known to dread nothing. Better still, Monsieur de Trevec earns 10,000 crowns per annum, which makes him a very great and noble indeed. And he started from scratch just like you. Go to him with this letter, and model your behavior upon his, in order to accomplish what he has accomplished. Whereupon the old man buckled his own sword unto his son's belt, kissed him tenderly on both cheeks, and gave him his blessing. Leaving his father, the young man went to his mother's apartment, where she awaited him with the sovereign remedy, which, thanks to the advice we have already reported, was subsequently to be employed so often. In this interview, the adieux were longer and more tender than in the other. It was not because Monsieur d'Artagnan failed to cherish his son, but because he was a man, and he would have deemed it unworthy for a man to give away his feelings, whereas Madame d'Artagnan was a woman, and more a mother. So she wept copiously, and to the honor of Monsieur d'Artagnan the younger, notwithstanding the efforts he made to refrain firm as a future musketeer should be, nature prevailed, and he too shed many tears, half of which he managed to get at great pains to conceal. The same day the youth set out on his journey equipped with his father's 3 gifts, namely the 15 crowns, the horse, and the letter to Monsieur de Tv. As well may be imagined, the audience had been thrown into the bargain. With such a vademecum, D'Artagnan was morally and physically an exact replica of Cervantes' hero, to whom we so abruptly compared him when our duties as historian placed us under the necessity of sketching his portrait. The Spanish Don took windmills for giants and sheep for armies. His Gascon counterpart took every smile for an insult and every glance for a challenge. Accordingly, from Tarbes in the Pyrenees all the way to Meung-en-Delort, he kept his fist clenched or pressed down his hand against the hilt of his sword 10 times a day. Yet his fist did not crash down on any jaw, nor did his sword issue from its scabbard. To be sure, the sight of a wretched nag excited many a smile as D'Artagnan rode by, but against the nag's flank rattled a sword of respectable length, and over the sword gleamed an eye more ferocious than proud. Passer-by therefore repressed their hilarity, or if hilarity prevailed over prudence, they attempted to laugh at one side of their faces only, as do the masks of the ancients. Thus D'Artagnan remained mystic in version and his susceptibility until he reached the inauspicious town of Meung. There he was alighting from his horse at the gate of the Folly Miller, without anyone, host, waiter, or ostler, coming to hold his stirrup. D'Artagnan spied, through open window, on the ground floor, a gentleman of a fine figure and proud, though somewhat swollen, mien. This person was talking to two others who appeared to be listening to him with great deference. D'Artagnan, fancying quite naturally, according to habit, that he was an object of their conversation, listened attentively. This time D'Artagnan was only part mistaken. He was not being discussed. His nag was. Apparently the gentleman was treating his audience to an enumeration of all the nag's qualities, and the audience being highly respectful of the narrator, there were bursts of raucous laughter at every moment. If the suggestion of a smile sufficed to stir the ire of Argiscon, he may readily imagine how this vociferous jollity affected him. However, D'Artagnan first wished to examine the insolent fellow who dared make mock of him. His haughty glance fell upon the stranger, a man of 40 or 45 years, pale of complexion, with piercing black eyes, a nose boldly fashioned in black, impeccably trimmed moustache. He wore a doublet and a hose of violet, with trimming like color, and no other ornament save the customary slashes through which the shirt appeared. Though new, his doublet and hose looked rumpled, like travelling clothes long packed in a portmanteau. D'Artagnan took in all these details with the speed of a most meticulous observer, and also doubtless with an instinctive presentiment that this stranger was to exercise a powerful influence on his future life. As D'Artagnan stared at the gentleman in violet, the latter was uttering a most sagacious and profound commentary of the nag of Béarn. His two auditors roared with laughter, at which the narrator actually smiled. This time there could be no doubt whatsoever. D'Artagnan had truly been insulted. Convinced of it, he pulled his beret down over his eyes, and attempting to copy certain courtly gestures he had picked up from the nobleman travelling through Gascony, he stepped forward, his right hand on the hilt of his sword, his left against his hip. Unfortunately, fast as he moved, waxing angrier at every step, he seemed to become more confused. Instead of polite, lofty speech he had prepared as a challenge, his tongue could produce nothing better than vulgar exclamation, which he topped off with a furious gesture. "Look here, monsieur!" he cried. "Look here, you there sulking behind that shutter! Yes, I mean you! Look here! Tell me what you are laughing at, will you? And we can laugh together." The gentleman's gaze moved slowly from the nag and slowly toward its master, though a certain lapse of time were requisite before he could understand how such extraordinary reproaches could be levelled at him. Then, when he could entertain no doubt on the matter, he frowned slightly. A moment later, in a tone of irony indescribable in its insolence, he replied, "I am not aware that I was addressing you, monsieur." "Never mind," countered D'Artagnan, exasperated by this medley of insolence and good manners, of convention and disdain. "I was addressing you." The stranger eyed at him, smiling fleetingly as before, and withdrawing from the window, walked slowly out of the inn. He took his stand 2 paces from D'Artagnan and stood there, rooted on the spot, staring at his horse. His tranquil manner and bantering air increased the hilarity of his auditors, who were still gathered round the window, watching the scene. Seeing him approach, D'Artagnan drew his sword a full foot out of its scabbard. "Upon my word, this horse is certainly a buttercup," observed the stranger, pursuing his investigations. His remarks were addressed to his audience at the window. Apparently, he was quite unconscious of D'Artagnan's exasperation, although the youth stood between him and his audience. "This color is quite common in botany, but until now
It has been very rare among horses.
Leffie, my horse, will you? Said D'Artagnan angrily. He recalled how his hero, Monsieur de Treville, had ridden a bob-tailed nag from the Midi to fortune. Oh, I dare you to smile at his master.
As you may judge from my cast of features, monsieur, I do not laugh frequently, the stranger replied, but I intend to preserve the privilege of laughing at whatever I please.
As for me, cried D'Artagnan, I will brook no man's laughter when it irks me.
Very well, monsieur. I dare say you are right,
Said the stranger, edging away, but D'Artagnan was not the type of youth to suffer anyone to escape him, least of all a man who had ridiculed him so impudently. Drawing a sword at long last and for cause, he ran after the stranger, crying, turn about, master jester, he challenged. Must I strike you in the back?
strike me?
The stranger surveyed the young man with astonishment and scorn.
Come, lad, you must be crazy.
Then in subdued tones, as though talking to himself,
What a bore!
he sighed. What a fine this buck would be for his majesty! The royal musketeers are combing the country just to recruit such hotheads. He had barely finished speaking when D'Artagnan lunged at him, so impetuously that this jest might have been his last. The stranger drew his sword, saluted D'Artagnan, and took up his guard. But suddenly, at a sign, his two onlookers, backed up by the innkeeper, fell upon D'Artagnan with sticks, shovels, and tongs. While this sudden onslaught held D'Artagnan, the stranger sheathed his sword, and readily as he drawn it,
Plague upon these Gascons,
he muttered,
put him back on his argued nag, and away with him.
"Not before I kill you!"
Another Gascon boast. Really, you Gascons are incorrigible. Keep up the dance, since that is what he wants. When he is tired, we will cry quits.
But the stranger did not suspect of what stubborn stuff his later adversary was made. D'Artagnan was never one to knuckle under, so the fight went on for a few seconds more, until D'Artagnan, exhausted, dropped his broken sword. Simultaneously a cudgel struck him squarely on the forehead, bringing him to the ground, bloody and almost unconscious. It was at this moment that the citizenry of Meung came flocking from all sides to the scene of the action. The host, fearing a scandal, carried the wounded man into the kitchen, where some of the trifling attentions were administered. As for the stranger, he had resumed his stand at the window, whence he stared somewhat impatiently on the mob, obviously put out by all his pother. He seemed to resent the fact that the crowd would not disperse.
Well, how is the madman doing?
He inquired as the host poked his head through the door. Your Excellency is safe and sound, I trust. As safe as a house and sound as a bear, my good host. Did I ask you what happened with our young firebrand? He is better now. He fainted quite a way before he fainted, and gathered with all his strength to challenge and defy you.
Why, this fellow must be the devil in person.
Oh no, your Excellency, he is no devil. The horse shrugged his shoulders disparagingly. We searched him and rummaged through his kit. All we found was one clean shirt and 12 crowns in his purse, which didn't stop him from cursing you roundly. He said that if this had happened in Paris instead of Meung, you would have paid dearly for it.
The prince of the blood, no less, incognito and full of threats.
I've told your Excellency all this so you might be better on your guard.
Did he name any names?
He slapped his pocket and said, "What?" He said, "We will see what Monsieur de Treville thinks of this insult."
Monsieur de Treville.
The stranger started. He struck his pocket and mentioned Monsieur de Treville. Come, come, my dear host.
While your young man was unconscious, I'm sure you did not fail to look into this pocket. What did you find?
A letter addressed to Monsieur de Trevay, Captain of the Musketeers.
Indeed.
Exactly as I have the honor to tell your excellency. The innkeeper, who was not gifted with great perspicacity, failed to observe the other's expression with hearing this news. The stranger moved away from the window and frowning.
The devil, he muttered. Can Trevay have set this Gascon on my trail? He is very young. Still, sword thrust is a sword thrust, whatever the fencer's age. Besides, the youth arouses less suspicion than an older man.
Then he fell into a deep silence after 7 minutes.
Come, come, my good host. Please rid me of this crazy lad. I can't kill him, and yet,
His expression was cold and threatening.
yet he is a great nuisance. Where is this fellow?
Upstairs in my wife's room, where he's dressing his wounds. Did you take his rags and kit up? Did you remove the doublet? All of his stuff is downstairs in the kitchen. But this young fool annoys you. He annoys me very much.
He caused an uproar in your hostelry, a thing which respectable people cannot abide. Go upstairs, make out my bill, and summon my lackey.
What? Is Monsieur leaving already?
Of course, I told you to have my horse saddled. Have you done so?
Indeed, your excellency, yes. Your horse is ready, saddled for you to ride off.
Good, now do as I told you.
Lord save us, the host said, examining the stranger. Can he be afraid of this stripling? He wondered. The imperious look from the stranger sent him about his business, and bowing humbly, he withdrew.
Milady must on no account be seen, the stranger mused. She will be passing through here soon. In fact, she's late already. I dare say I'd better ride out to meet her. If only I knew what was in this letter to Trevay.
Mumbling to himself, he made off for the kitchen. Meanwhile, the host, certain that the youth's presence had driven the stranger from his hostelry, ran upstairs to his wife's room. There he found D'Artagnan, who had at last come to, suggesting that the police would handle the youth pretty roughly for having picked a quarrel with the great lord, for he had no doubt that the stranger could be nothing less. The host persuaded D'Artagnan, weak though he was, to get up and be off. D'Artagnan rose. He was only still half conscious. He had just lost his doublet, and his head was swathed in linen cloth. Propelled by the innkeeper, we worked his way downstairs, but as he reached the kitchen, the first thing he saw was the stranger, standing at the step of a heavy carriage, with two large Norman horses in harness. He was chatting rather urbanely with a lady who leaned out the window of the coach to listen. She must have been about 20 years of age. D'Artagnan was no fool. At a glance he perceived that this was a woman who was young and beautiful, her beauty the more striking because it differed so radically from that of the Mede, where he had always lived. She was pale and fair, with long curls falling in profusion over her shoulders. She had large blue languishing eyes, rosy lips, and hands of alabaster. She was talking vivaciously to the stranger.
So his eminence orders me.
To return to England at once. Should the Duke leave London, you are to report directly to his eminence.
Any other instructions?
The fair traveller asked. They are in this box here. You do not open it until you have crossed the channel.
Very well. And you, what will you do?
I will go back to Paris. Oh God, I just messed up that whole conversation. Shouts out Octawave. Without chastising this incident, youth, the lady objected. The stranger was about to reply, but before he could open his mouth, D'Artagnan, who had heard all, bounded across the door-sill. This insolent youth does his own chastising, he cried, and this time I trust chastisement will not escape him.
Will not escape him, the stranger echoed, frowning.
With a woman present, I dare hope he will not run away. The stranger gasped at the hilt of his sword.
Milady, seeing this, cautioned.
Remember that less delay may ruin anything.
You're late, milady. Let us go our several ways.
Bowing to the lady, he sprang into his saddle. The coachman whipped up his horses and galloped in one direction. The stranger was ready to gallop off in the other, when suddenly the host appeared, seeing his great lord about to disappear without settling his score. Mine host's affection yielded to the most profound concept.
What about the bill?
He shouted.
Pay him, goat.
The stranger to his lackey, tossing a purse to him, and they cantered off. The lackey checked his mount, flung 3 or 4 silver coins at the host's feet, and sped after his master. "Oh, you coward! You wretch! You bogus gentleman!" cried D'Artagnan, springing forward in turn after the lackey. But his wounds had left him too weak to bear the strain of such exertion. He had not taken 10 steps before he felt his ears ringing. A giddiness swept over him, a cloud of blood rolled over his eyes, and he fell in the middle of the street crying, "Coward! Coward!"
A coward he is.
Mine host agreed as he went to D'Artagnan's aid, flattering him as the hero of the fable flattered the snail he had scorned the evening before. "He's a coward, a base coward," D'Artagnan murmured. "But the lady, how beautiful she was!"
Who?
"Milady," D'Artagnan faltered as he fainted once again.
Well, thought the host, I've lost 2 clients, but I still have this one. I'm good to keep him for a few days. That means even the crowns are good.
11 crowns represent the exact sum that remained in D'Artagnan's purse. The innkeeper had reckoned D'Artagnan's convalescence at 1 crown per day for 11 days. When mine host had reckoned without his guest, D'Artagnan rose the next day at 5 o'clock, went down to the kitchen unaided, and requested several things. First, for certain ingredients, the nature of which had not been transmitted to us. Then he asked for wine, oil, and rosemary as his mother's recipe in hand. He concocted a balsam, in which he anointed his numerous wounds. He himself laid compress after compress on them, steadfastly refusing the assistance of any physician. Doubtless thanks to the efficacy of the gypsy slave, and perhaps the absence of any medico, D'Artagnan felt much restored that evening, and practically cured on the morrow. D'Artagnan was prepared to settle his score. His only extras were for the rosemary oil and wine. The master had fasted, while the yellow nag, according to the innkeeper, had eaten 3 times as much as a nag of such proportions could possibly assimilate. In his pocket D'Artagnan found only his worn velvet purse, and the 11 livres which it contained. As for the letter to Monsieur de Treville, it had vanished. He began to search for it with utmost patience, to turn his pockets and gusses inside out over and over, to rummage time after time in his bag, to ransack his purse, opening it, closing it, opening it again and again. Then, convinced at last that the letter was not to be found, he flew for a third time into such a fit of fury that he might have easily required a fresh supply of wine and aromatic oils. Mine host saw this young firebrand on a rampage, and heard him vow to tear down the establishment if his letter were not forthcoming. Immediately he seized a spit, his wife a broom, and his servants the very cudgels they had used 2 days before. "Give me my letter!" D'Artagnan kept shouting. "Give me my letter, or by the holy blood I'll spit you through the ortolans." Unfortunately, there was one circumstance which prevented him from carrying out his threat. His sword had been broken in two during his first conflict, a fact which we have chronicled, but which he had completely forgotten. Accordingly, when D'Artagnan sought to draw his blade, he found himself with no more than a stump 8 or 10 inches long, which the innkeeper carefully replaced in his scabbard. As for the rest of the blade, the host had hawkily set aside, in order to make of it larding thing. Greatly as his disappointment was, it would probably have not deterred our young hothead if the innkeeper had not realized that the objection was perfectly justified.
Yes, it's true, said mine host, lowering his feet. Where is that letter?
Oi, where is that letter? D'Artagnan repeated. Let me tell you, that letter was addressed to Monsieur de Treville. It must be found, and if it isn't, Monsieur de Treville will know the reason why. The threat completed the intimidation of the innkeeper, and the king and the cardinal, and Monsieur de Treville was probably the most important figure in the realm, a constant subject of discussion amongst soldiers and even citizens. To be sure, there was also the famous Father Joseph, but his name was never breathed above a whisper, so great was the terror inspired by the grey eminence to give the cardinal's familiar his popular nickname. Throwing down his spit and ordering his wife's servants to cast away their respective weapons, the innkeeper himself inaugurated the search for the missing document.
Was there anything valuable in your letter?
He asked after a few moments of futile endeavor.
God's blood, I should say so, replied the Gascon.
He had not been counting on this letter to speed his advancement in the court.
It contained my whole fortune.
Draft on the Spanish treasury?
Mine host asked with a worried air.
No, D'Artagnan answered. Drafts on the privy treasury of His Majesty of France.
Having expected to enter the king's service on the strength of this recommendation, he believed himself justified in hazarding this somewhat misleading reply without incurring the stigma of lying.
God help us all, wailed the host.
It is of no moment,
D'Artagnan said with true Gascon phlegm.
It is of no moment. Money means nothing to me.
He paused.
But that letter meant everything. I would rather have lost 1,000 pistoles than that letter.
He might as readily have risked 20,000, but a certain youthful modesty restrained him. Just as the innkeeper, finding no trace of the letter, was about to commit himself to the devil, a ray of light pierced his skull.
The letter is not lost.
What?
The letter is not lost. It was stolen from you.
Stolen? Who stole it?
The gentleman who was here yesterday. He come down here to the kitchen where you left your doublet. He was alone here for quite a while. I'll wager he stole your letter.
Do you think so?
D'Artagnan asked. He was somewhat skeptical, for he knew better than anybody else. It was purely personal. How could it have become valuable enough to steal? No servant, no traveler could have gained anything by possessing it.
You say you suspect the impertinent gentleman?
Sure as I stand here. All told him you, monsieur, were the protege of Monsieur de Treville. All said you even had a letter for this illustrious gentleman. Well, the stranger looked very much disturbed. He asked me where the letter was and went straight away down to the kitchen. He knew your doublet was in there.
He's a thief, then, D'Artagnan scowled. I shall complain to Monsieur de Treville, and Monsieur de Treville will complain to the king.
Majestically he drew 2 crowns from his purse and handed them to the innkeeper, and made for the gate. Mine host closed on his heel, hat in hand. The yellow nag awaited him. He leaped onto the saddle and rode off. His steed bore him without further misadventure to the Porte Saint-Antoine, the northern gate of Paris, where its owner sold it for 3 crowns, an excellent price considering that D'Artagnan had pressed it hard during the last stage of his journey. The dealer to whom D'Artagnan had sold it for the aforesaid 9 livres did not fail to make it clear that he was disbursing this exorbitant sum only because of the originality of the beast's color. So D'Artagnan entered Paris on foot, carrying his kit under his arm. Oh, let me get a quick drink. Shouts out to Octawave. So D'Artagnan entered Paris on foot, carrying his kit under his arm, roaming the city until he found a room suited to his scanty means. It was a sort of garret, situated in the Rue des Fossiers, Gravediggers' Row, near Luxembourg Palace. Having paid a deposit, D'Artagnan took possession of his lodging, and spent the rest of the day sewing. His specific task was to stitch onto his doublet and hose some ornamental braiding which his mother had ripped off an almost new doublet of her husband's and gave to her son secretly. Next he repaired the Croix de Fer to have a new blade put on his sword, and then he walked back toward the Louvre to ask the first musketeer he met where Monsieur de Treville's mansion was. It proved to be in the Rue des Vieux Combiers, quite close to where D'Artagnan had taken a room. The circumstance appeared to him to augur well for the success of his journey. After this, gratified with the way in which he had behaved at Meung, clear of all remorse for the past, confident in the present, and full of hope for the future, he retired to bed to sleep the sleep of the valiant. This sleep, the sleep of one who was still a provincial, occupied him till morning. At 9 o'clock he rose, dressed, and set out for the mansion of the illustrious Monsieur de Treville, the third personage in the kingdom, according to Monsieur d'Artagnan the elder. Very based, very red-pilled. So we got the first fight scene, the first. Shouts out against the world. Gee. Shouts out Octawave. Shouts out to r/alternate history Discord. Y'all know what we all about. Having some fun today. We got 20 minutes, and it took me about 40 to get through 16 pages. And this chapter ends in 10 pages. We can totally do it. Chapter 2. The Antechamber of Monsieur de Treville. Monsieur de Treville, as his family was still called in Gascony, or Monsieur de Treville, as he ended by styling himself in Paris, had begun life exactly as D'Artagnan. He marched on the capital without a sound to his name, but possessed that wealth of audacity, shrewdness, and intelligence whereby the poorest and humblest Gascon gentleman often derives brighter hopes from his paternal heritage than the richest, loftiest nobleman from Perigord or Berry realizes materially from his. His insolent bravery, his still more insolent success at a time when blows were thick as hops, sped him to the top of the difficult ladder called court favor. He had scaled it 4 steps at a time. Monsieur de Treville was a friend of the reigning King Louis XIII, who, as is well known, venerated the memory of his father, Henry IV. Now Monsieur de Trevet's father had served Henry IV with unfailing loyalty during the wars of religion. The monarch could not rewrite him in coin of the realm. He was short of that commodity all his life long, and he used to pay his debts with only staple he never had to cause to borrow ready wit. And so Henry of Navarre, having captured Paris and become King of France, being short of money, as we have said, authorized the late Monsieur de Trevet to assume for arms a lion or passant upon Giles, in non-heretic heraldic terms, a golden lion walking and looking towards the right, and with right forepaw raised, in the motto of Fidelis et Fortis, loyal and brave. Oh no. Oh, they're not gonna let me extend the session on the library computer, even though they're gonna be open for 20 more minutes. So, I guess today was just meant to be chapter 1, and that's all it's gotta be. And that's kind of cool, though. Thank you so much to everybody for showing up, showing out, tuning in. All kinds of love to the library, Anderson Library. I ruined their quiet in exchange for reading literature. Of course, gotta show the Leos some love. It's y'all's season. You're responsible for some of the dopest writers in a few different languages. So don't ever let anyone count you out, Leos. Personally, I'm a Cancer, so just try to keep some of the bad vibes away from me. Nah, I'm kidding. Love y'all. And love Dumas, who was quite literally a weed-smoking black man in 1840s France when he wrote this. Trust me, you gotta look that up. He is dope beyond logic and reason. But I guess that's it for the day. One more time, some love for Against the World G. Octawave, the crew over at r/alternate history of Discord. Brittany and Rock, Don't Watch Continue, and Dog Rose and Deadmind. Renzo Flutes. All of his Japanese crew. I know I'm thinking of somebody I'm missing. Raheem, Brittany, Marie. There's someone else, I'm sure. But we'll call it a day. One love, y'all. Remember to read daily. Well, Faith and FA gang. We out.